Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randall Baier. Today we'll be discussing books that Rip Rap has received for review. Welcome to Rip Rap. Again, Randy.
Once again, I'm glad to be here and welcome to your show. Thank you for welcoming me to your show once again. I'm ready for the surprises.
One of the first books is The Power of Their Ideas, Lessons for America from a Small School in Harlem by Deborah Baier. And I found this really interesting. She's the principal of Central Park East in East Harlem, the so-called inner city school, where 90% of school students graduate and 90% go to college. But she's an advocate for developing inner city education and for public schools in themselves, because she sees them as an issue of democracy. And I just like this whole thing of listening to the voices of the students and the power of their ideas. I mean, it's just a wonderful book that way. And she talks in the book about 5-year-old Darnell. She thought she'd just talk about the most obvious examples between living and non-living. And she chose a rock and the gerbil in their classroom.
Okay.
And so she thought that she'd leave the gray areas for later. But 5-year-old Darnell insisted on making it difficult. Rocks change, he said, and rocks move. And he reminded everyone that on the trip to Central Park, Deborah Baier, had described how rocks had come down with the glaciers and how they changed shape over time. And so one said even they reproduce because little rocks break off from big ones. And I love that. What she liked was the following through, the remembering and observing and reflecting.
And they're thinking through that.
And she said, how can we show kids that it is precisely in such ideas that important discoveries are made? And so that's where she goes on to develop this book about, in the first chapter, is In Defense of Public Education. And I just love that whole thing. She began her teaching career as a kindergarten teacher in Chicago, and MacArthur Foundation Fellowship for her work in New York. And she's currently leading an effort to create 50 more innovative public schools in New York City. So I just thought that was a good place to start, because one of my interests is in improving education.
It sounds reminiscent of some of Jonathan Kozol's work, not only because of the sort of inner city connection, but because of the working with a generation that maybe in the mainstream it's considered kind of a lost age group or a lost constituency.
Well, and she says one of her colleagues, Ann Busses, said that teaching is not so complex as to verge on the impossible or defy conception at abstract level, but it does defy concrete prescriptions for action. There is neither prescription for action nor checklist for observation to assure intelligent and responsive teaching. It's the teacher. And in some of this foo-flaw that's going on with No Child Left Behind, somehow the teachers get left behind because you have all these statistics that are flowing around with standardized testing and everything.
Sure, and you're looking at the aggregate, the results in the aggregate, as opposed to what's really going on perhaps in each.
And she says if we intend to dramatically improve the education of American kids, teachers must be challenged to invent schools they would like to teach and learn in, organized around the principles of learning that we know.
Why does she work in the school that she works in, as opposed to, is she trying to make the case that stereotypically we think of an inner city school as bound to fail? And look at what's happening here. There's a success rate that's even higher than the norm, say a suburban school or
An interesting point, she says, is why were the self-confident voices I knew so well at home and on the playground muted in the schools I taught in? And so she's deliberately selecting this as a challenge for her development as a teacher. Yeah, that's a rough place to go because everyone says, oh, these schools can't make it, and yet they can, if you have teachers who can teach. She said that her school, Central Park East, graduated its first high school students in 1991, so it's one of these innovative projects.
It's a newer school in
Yeah.
terms of its history, 20 years
About
old.
doing, and she says defending public education is difficult, but the best defense is by example.
Mm-hmm.
City schools seem to many to be especially hopeless, and many who would probably love to support public education feel it's romantic to hold on to dreams such as ours. It's a very difficult issue because it's right here in Detroit, the Detroit Public Schools, and they're trying to refashion, what's happening. And one of the things you were remarking about, the teachers were unhappy about the focus on breaking everything down into discrete skills rather than introducing strong subject matter. A focus that we saw in so many of the innovative schools that label themselves open or progressive. So that's another insight into one of the primary reasons for starting the school, although we didn't often admit it, was our personal desire for greater autonomy as teachers. We spoke a lot about democracy, but we were just plain sick and tired of having to waste so much time and energy negotiating with school officials over what seemed like common sense requests, worrying about myriad rules and regulations, being forced to compromise on many of our beliefs. And I think that whole thing of the innovation, you have to balance it out though. Are you building skills or you're building indulgence? I mean, that's a real difficult thing to get into. And she also says, we know that the school's pedagogy doesn't always rest easily with parents. I've had other colleagues talk about that if you're trying something new and the parents don't understand it, then you've got a real issue there.
Well, also because I imagine the parents want something that has a discrete outcome and probably has discrete, maybe perhaps more black and white kinds of limits in terms of the way you approach problems, teaching, learning, discipline. I mean, it sounds like they have kind of a more open approach to the fuzzy edges.
Well, and my own students have talked, they're really serious about wanting to get their students to have the skill set that they need.
Yeah.
And they're not willing to sacrifice that for any innovation, in a way. You can do it, if you can do the learning of the basic skill sets and be innovative, that's one thing. But they don't want their students to create a deficit because, like Deborah says in the book, is these are children already handicapped by racism and poverty.
Yeah.
So you got to be really careful about what you're doing and why you're doing it. But she argues that choice can save public education. One of the interesting points that she makes is, if we're talking about individual classrooms, size is important. But she said we're talking about creation of a thoughtful school culture. And I like that phrase. That's where size becomes decisive, especially if we're trying to create a change culture. So she's looking for transformative change, which it needs to happen. You can't do just the same old. And she uses another key concept, which is, she talks about this continuing dialogue, face to face, over and over, is a powerful educative force. That's what really works.
Between student and teacher?
Everybody.
Or everybody.
Students, administrators.
Right.
Another important concept she talks about is respect.
Yeah.
That you need to have everyone. Says teaching called for every kind and form of knowledge. Nothing might possibly pass me as irrelevant to my new professional calling. I think that's the endless, inquisitive, searching for meaning is what's important with all this. And she also talked about the need to reinvent teaching. I think that some teachers have gotten into the same old kind of pattern that just keep replicating the same thing, and they're not asking themselves, well, how is this changing? What are the needs of the students, of these particular students?
Right.
And that's what works too.
This group, this year, this time.
Yeah. So I like that idea of the power of their ideas, which also implies there's research by Baier and Tag about the learning paradigm. Instead of the instruction paradigm where you're shoving the stuff toward the students, the learning paradigm is the interactive dialogue.
Right. Well, that's what came out with that example about the rock, the guinea pig and the rock. I mean,
they're going a different way than she suspected they would.
Right. I think so they were processing that and going, well, wait a minute. I mean, that's brilliant. The rocks reproduce.
Yeah.
I mean, up to this moment, I never.
How do you define reproduction?
Right.
Does that mean you can make smaller pieces?
So they're really thinking about the fact that an organism can replicate itself, and that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Excellent. Well, the next book here is No Impact Man: The Adventures of a Guilty Liberal who attempts to save the planet, and the discoveries he makes about himself and our way of life in the process, by Colin Beavan. There's a quote on the front here by Bill Kibben, sort of a blurb. There's something of Thoreau in Colin Beavan's great project, but a fully engaged, connected, and right this minute helpful version. So,
it's a fascinating thing. If you're going to talk about leading an ecological life, how do you do that?
Right.
And to what degree?
How do you integrate it into your own?
He's living in the middle of Manhattan, and then starting to worry about his carbon footprint, as they say.
Yes, yeah.
So it really ends up with some intriguing dilemmas. Like, he likes pizza, but pizza's delivered in cardboard boxes. So, and when you think about that, how would pizza otherwise be handled? I mean, you'd have to go and pick it up, or have some kind of recyclable thing?
I have thought about this with pizza. I mean, with anything that gets delivered in cardboard, and it trickles down to almost any mundane object. If you're, in fact, I know that there are some college campuses now that at their eateries, there are no takeout cups anymore. And of course, you see most students nowadays with their own sort of water cup, but now they have to take, their own coffee cup. They have an arsenal of different containers because the rule is, sorry, we don't, you can't take it away. Now, how do you deal with the pizza business and the convenience of our life? We have such a kind of take-out, eat-out culture. It's different from whatever could be called traditional, in the sense of making food at home with utensils that are, and washing dishes and having items that just don't replicate. You're constantly using the same tools. It is a problem of life, but it's also theoretical. It's fun to think as well.
Well, what I liked about it, he kept taking these things and extending them through, because if you're going to do that, then what does it take?
Right.
He decides he's going to ride a bike instead of drive a car.
Right.
But what kind of bike? Because you're not talking about a bike you're just going to go for a little exercise to the park or something. You're talking about a bike that's now going to have to service as your main tool for getting around, and so it's got to be sturdier and stronger.
Very resilient.
Yeah, and handle the weather.
Maybe he has precious metals in his bike. For highly lightweight.
And who made the bike, and where was it?
And the whole issue.
So it was made in Japan, then, and he talks about his wife wears Prada, the fashion, and that was a bit of an issue, because that meant shipping, stuff back and forth. And so it just gradually, if you're really trying to live a no-impact ecological life, it really gets complicated.
Yeah.
And because there's so many things we take for granted.
And so much pressure to use things in a certain way, to use products in a certain way. What I like in this book are the little pithy blocked out statements in boldface. These statements like, there is a reason why trash bags aren't made of transparent plastic, or suburbia, the great American experiment in the solitude of a man's home is his castle, is pretty much a failure, and so on. And there's so much in a vast, nearly empty ocean. Mr. Fish would have a hard time finding Mrs. Fish in order to make baby fish. I don't know the full context of that statement, but
the whole thing is, and I've read in other books about the big cruise ships dump bags of garbage over, into the ocean, and that's a primary source of pollution in the ocean. Well, first of all, under the no impact thing, would you have cruise ships?
Well, exactly.
And if you did, how would they operate? Because their whole thing is luxury and conspicuous consumption
and display. Yeah, exactly. True. And you're also putting 4,000 people, or however many, 2,000 people, into this floating entity, this island of self-contained. It's different from the campers who say what you take in, you take out. Here, what you take in, you throw out. I'm sure there probably are some rules about cruise ships, but it is true. I've heard that there are, in the Pacific Ocean, there's a vast zone of trash that is floating, suspended in the ocean, not moving because of the various currents, but it's found this kind of place where there's just this, subsurface zone of world trash that's floating out there. And because of the currents, it's, somewhere southwest of Hawaii.
Well, we've all heard of conspicuous consumption. He talks about inconspicuous consumption.
Which is what? How does he define
In other
that?
words, instead of glorifying consumption per se, and being the one with the biggest, baddest, most beautiful thing, is to accept the other end of that same premise, which is to not seek recognition by how much you use and eat and throw out. It's, what you reuse and redo and recycle. But I can imagine people reading this book and go, wow, that's just really hard. It's one thing to talk all these nice phrases about, oh yeah, we ought to save the planet by recycling, but then you get down to the doing of it, and then that becomes rough.
Well, I mean, I know that just in the everyday world of, say, international travel or tourism, I mean, in my own experience, when I first went to Indonesia, the street food was all wrapped in banana leaves, lotus leaves, bamboo leaves, wide leaves, and they actually worked, or newspaper, and they worked marvelously as a package. Now, it's all plastic, and it's all new paper lined with plastic, as opposed to, say, some recycled newspaper. So that plastic has to go somewhere, and the natural package is not really done that much anymore.
Well, we've talked before about how just around Ann Arbor, Detroit area, you have landfills that are the size of mountains now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they just go there and dump it, and now and then they stick a tube down it to regulate the gases.
Right. Yes.
And because where's it going to go?
It's growing, right? Yeah. Well, so what is the insight from the title? The discoveries he makes about himself and our way of life.
That it was just a lot more difficult to do than what he realized.
Yeah.
That if he was going to, and also the degree of purism he'd have about interpreting the restrictions on how he's going to lead this no-impact life.
Right.
But strictly interpreted, it's just about impossible to lead a no-impact life when you're in the middle of one of the biggest cities in the world.
Right, it's by definition you're having an impact, or in the verbal sense, you are literally impacting.
So you may be riding your bike and you may be eating all this wonderful food, but then there's all the cabs, trucks, cars, the air conditioners, all the wasteful stuff that's going on around you.
Right.
But I think he was also trying to make the point that change, which I agree with, change happens one by one.
Yeah.
And so but it's a very interesting thing of taking it, okay, if we're really going to lead a no-impact life, what does that take? And it's shocking what that would take.
What it will take. Well, it sounds like this book reminds me of some other media experiments that have come along as well. There's a documentary movie out on corn now. I think it may be called King Corn, in which the authors of the movie they try to figure out what is the impact of 1 acre of corn. What does it take to grow that? And when you harvest it, where does it go? And what does it become? And they actually discover that in our hair follicles, there's protein derived from corn. And in the basic American diet, and because of corn starch and syrup, you know, basically all over the world. But they sort of look at, it's a micro kind of argument about what happens when you do this one thing. What's the impact? And it sounds like this book is kind of in that realm of experiment to try to determine.
Oh, similarly, I was talking with a student from Indonesia, and she was kind of playing down the whole thing of eating rice. I said, you got to be kidding. People have been eating rice, you know, for thousands of years, and it was very ecological because they would grow their own product, eat it, then cultivate the next crop, and it was very ecological. A lot of those places are now starting to eat McDonald's hamburgers, beef, which is one of the most notoriously wasteful ways of, you know, of a cuisine, because how much water it takes to feed the corn, to feed the cattle, and feed the cattle, and all that stuff.
And then process.
Yeah.
And get to you, and ultimately it's a,
yeah.
It may even be a corn product. If you
well, and I don't suspect that cows would do all that well in Indonesia,
no.
So you'd have to be importing all this beef.
Yeah.
And I said, you know, that's a horrible thing. I mean, in that whole issue of food and what's ecological to a culture, I mean, like Korean cultures have a heavy emphasis on marinating and preserving, you know, vinegar and stuff because of where they are. You know, that's a good way to, you know, preserve seafood and other vegetables and stuff.
Right, which would normally...
Yeah, which is indigenous to their particular circumstance. So if they make those changes, what they're doing, it's starting to become McDonaldized, that becomes a waste, you know, and it's just terrible. But I thought it was interesting because it might get people thinking about what would have happened if we're going to have to do it someplace.
Yeah, right. Well, it's taking sort of a mundane issue and putting a kind of thoughtful, analytical spin on it to say, okay, it's almost a kind of exercise in philosophy in some ways.
Taking it on out.
Thinking Out Loud is our next one.
Thinking Out Loud, A Decade of Thoughts in Higher Education by Stephen Joel Trockenberg, one of the leading scholars, was also the 15th president of George Washington University. And I thought it was an interesting book because he talks about, for example, teaching effectiveness and the need for academic change, which is again what we were talking about. He said that many years ago I began to observe that university presidents don't usually add to their popularity when they attempt to meddle in academic matters.
Right.
And yet that's what's got to happen. You know, it isn't enough these days to just talk about it. We're going to have to do it. And then he talks about America has become a nation in which more and more money began pouring into our colleges and universities, while the salaries of teachers and staff members only rose gradually. So he's raising some, like, one of the observations he has, across the nation, people who work in higher education will start to experience the process traditionally referred to as going back to the drawing board.
Right. Well, what are some of the substantial things he advocates? I mean, does he advocate for a renewed, energized professoriate, so to speak, or an energized academic resurgence? Or does he emphasize I mean, it seems to me that student services, athletics, social life, those things really seem to be on the forefront in academic discussions of university and what universities provide these days.
It can be, and I've just been in some discussions about that student services are integral to the performance of an institution of higher education, because that helps the student by taking care of that business. But there really is an interaction or synergy that happens, because what's happening in terms of student services can inform and help the academic side. But his thing is, I'm not sure that he's got one of those big, bold, new ideas, but he's becoming aware about the extent of the change that we need to make. And for example, he talks about, consider our sense of time. When we're not doing work that we actually hate, most of us no longer experience the type of boredom which the French have always called ennui. It was so common among even young people in the 1950s. So I think he's more aware of...
In other words, we have, actually, even in our off time, we have more interesting things to do.
If we could conceptualize it as that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a thing that he points out in here about this whole dangerous thing of saying if you get a degree, you get a job.
Mm. It's very dangerous.
Because the quid pro quo
Yes,
thing
exactly.
can be very, very wicked.
Well, it's dangerous because it just seems to bring out a tension that's always there behind academia, and that is, do you want to learn something so you go out and apply it immediately, or do you want to learn to think in some way, engage in some critical thinking so that you're ready to live your life in no matter what, you know, walk of life you decide to, you know, concentrate in, whatever your job becomes, whatever interests you take on, whatever people you engage with. And that seems to be a real tension in university life these days. I mean, you're there for, the typical undergraduate's there for 4 years. What is it that is the outcome?
Well, a humorous point he makes is why it matters how we cut the cake. It matters because understanding the best way to do it, to really reflect on it, is important. It's not enough just to do it, but to reflect on what it is, even the smallest detail. In fact, my father always used to say, the professional is someone who's always attending to the very smallest detail. That's what's really important. And it also has the carryover to what you learn in academy also carries over to everyday life, and that's another point that he makes.
Yeah.
So it's a series of reflections.
It is a tension. I mean, in my own classes, invariably in the first 3 weeks, first 2 weeks, there's a question. What will this class do for me? Why do I have... The question, why do I have to do something? Okay, that's a fair question. I mean, everybody asks that question. But what's it going to get me is what...
That's sometimes that pragmatic thing.
Right,
the
right.
Praxis.
That's problematic for people that... maybe just those that enjoy reading, learning, thinking just for its own benefit.